Good morning. We are learning in the Hemshech Tafresh Sadik Daled 5694 page, with the bottom of page 82, beginning page 83, which corresponds to Ayin Beis, volume 2, page 1149. So the Frierdiker Rebbe is now wrapping up where we left off when we finished the last time learning Ayin Beis a few weeks ago, or whenever it was, probably around 10 days ago, with discussion of the process, the divine process of the earliest stages of how existence begins to emerge in divine consciousness. I'm using divine consciousness as another way of saying Ein Sof Lifnei Tzimtzum. That it consists of Oir. We know there's Oir, a field of energy, a reflection, some manifestation. And in Oir itself emerges what we discussed, the levels of desire, Ratzon. First, he spoke about 2 levels of Ratzon. And then he turns it into 3 levels: Ratzon HaKlali, Ratzon Prati, and Ratzon HaKodem, which in turn also breaks down into levels. Essentially, from the moment of a stirring of a consideration of a relationship with another, meaning in the divine, and we're talking now not in the human being. In the human being, it's also the mashal, the dugma. We are an example for this, so we have some inkling, some portrait, some snapshot, some picture of image of what's happening, is that the stirrings means where God begins to relate to somewhat within his own divine consciousness, begins a relationship to at least a consideration of a relationship, and then how that solidifies and starts getting a shape and a determination, and then moves to Ratzon Prati, which begins to define it in detail. Finally, Ratzon Kodem, Shir Atzmei, where he envisions, and we said prepares the resources, allocates, measures, and allocates the resources all before the Tzimtzum. That's essentially where we are up to. All this is happening in Ein Sof before the Tzimtzum. I want to just say one thing to make things a little clear and maybe put things in context. I was looking around at the sources. Where does this original idea of Heskim, Shakvitaria, and Achlota come from? So I found that it's a mimer from the Alter Rebbe. It's called the Drush Gimel Mine Adam. I mentioned this drush a number of times. So drush of the Alter Rebbe that's printed in that's printed in the Maimorim of the Alter Rebbe called in Yonim, right in the beginning, and that Tzemach Tzedek has that same discourse, same Maimer, with many comments on it. There he brings this idea, but interesting thing is there he speaks about it all in Odem after the Tzimtzum, and explains that this idea of coming from a Heskim, a consideration, until it becomes an active pursuit, he speaks about it all post Tzimtzum, with Odem Kadam being the Ratzon Klali, the general desire for creation. And then it evolves similar to the steps that are here. Not every step spelled out there, but the general gist of it is there. But in Imre Bina, from the Mittler Rebbe, he brings this and he says that these levels after the Tzimtzum are rooted pre-Tzimtzum. So that is an interesting way of understanding how Chassidus so-called evolved and developed from the Alter Rebbe till what we're learning here, that initially the Alter Rebbe spoke about this all after the Tzimtzum, Because remember, after the tzimtzum, you're already talking about an active creation process. So whatever we're discussing here is not yet in any creation process. It's all within, for lack of a better way of saying it, the thought of God, all in the divine consciousness. Tzimtzum and then kav, and then all the levels that come from that is already the active creation process. And there too, you have these levels. But these levels there are already in a active state. So it just goes to show you how subtle this is. Because if you think about it, when you learn about Ak and the higher levels after the Tzimtzum, it's also, from our point of view, it's also abstract. It's also a Ratzon that's beyond us in many ways. And yet, the distinction would be that Lifnei Tzimtzum, as we learned at length and we discussed, it's completely in God's internal processes. Whereas once the Tzimtzum happens, even though it's still on a spiritual level, you can say you're already now in a state of going through these stages, but it's in a much more tangible way. What that means is that after the Tzimtzum, all this will replay itself, but now it's replaying itself in action. What I mean by that is, so once you come to the determination, and then you've come to the Ratzon Prati, and the Ratzon HaKodim. So Lifnei Tzimtzum, we're now stopped right before the Tzimtzum. At this point, the Tzimtzum will take over, will come into play, the Kav, and now the actual creation is happening. But in the creation process, you also have a Ratzon. You also have a Keser. Remember, every world has a Keser. So now it would be something like the Ratzon, how you're conveying your consideration in the creation process. It would be similar to, let's say, you'd be speaking now to the artist, would now be speaking to the, or not the artist, you who want a home would be speaking to the architect or to the contractor. And even though you could say, one second, the determination was made, everything was prepared, shouldn't the creation happen? But nevertheless, in the creation process, you also have all these stages, relatively speaking, of consideration, of deliberation, of determination, and then the active pursuit. So what needs to be explained is, so what's the difference between the processes after the Tzimtzum to the processes before the Tzimtzum? That deserves good explanation, but I did want to point out that the ideas are spoken about on both dimensions and levels. Now, the best way to explain it is by understanding that this isn't about, remember, this isn't about a consideration, a heskim that will later be negated. Even though technically speaking it's true that when you have haskama, it's possible, like he said in the previous page, 81, it's possible to then say, I'm not, once you deliberate, say that the deliberation contradicts the heskim klali. It could be lias hepech. It can be come to a conclusion that's different than the general consideration, but he made it clear afterwards that that's not the case, Lamaila. And even the nefesh, that's not the case. That the Shakavatari is not about, like in Seichel, you could say it's negating or weakening the original theory. In Ratzon, the Ratzon is there. It's only in a very early infancy stage where it's not shaped and formed. And the Shakavatari is much more about shaping it than anything else. Okay. But the bottom line is, what do we derive from it? That the Heskim level is essentially just the early stage of the shift of the nefesh to consider a relationship. The same thing Lamaila. It's not God considering maybe yes, maybe not. It's God basically coming to a state where he's beginning to relate the possibility of a relationship. Then that possibility gets stronger and stronger as he moves closer, as the divine consciousness moves closer to the creation. So if you think of it that way, then the same is after the Tzimtzum too, just on a different level. That there are levels that are beyond existence altogether, but now they're in the creative process. And then there's stages as it gets closer and closer to the ultimate objective of a created world, of Elam Hazeh, of this world, Elam Asiyah, Hagashmis V'Achumris. So the earlier stages are much more focused on the divine desire and the divine interest. And the later levels are focused more on the creation itself. So just as you say Lifnei Tzimtzum, you could also say Lachrat Tzimtzum, because you're not talking about, oh, 1 second, since you're already considered and determined and even allocated resources for creation, so what kind of new consideration is necessary? So you have to say it's not consideration, it's just a removed state. The energy after the Tzimtzum is still so high that its energy is focused more on the divine will and on the divine source than on the created object. So what needs to be explained is how you go level by level by level. But I've said this many times that for many of us, just the idea of moving from the material, crass, physical world to Asir Ruchnis is already a jump. And if you go to Yetzirah and Bria, that's also moving toward levels that are beyond existence as we know it. And yet, each level still has some relationship. So the truth is, it really comes down to back to what I always say about Aveda, depends where you're at. I said long ago that it's very difficult for us to relate, or impossible to relate Lifnei Tzimtzum. So we have to find commensurate to who we are, where our relationship is. Like I said, when you think about God providing life and sustenance, food, air, health, a family, parnasa, livelihood, so you can relate to that. That is God blessing you on your terms with your needs. And you can thank Hashem for that. There's an Avedis Sa'adam, person recognizing the gratitude, and that's a relationship with God as he relates to you. We could also jump a next step and say there's also the godliness that's beyond me, but it's all still relative to where you are. So that's why all these levels don't become real and active until you actually try to access them. So if you talk about it purely mechanically, yes, all these levels, before the Tzimtzum and after the Tzimtzum. But as I said, Chassidus is not about mechanics. It's about personal growth. And personal growth, you have to determine where are you, what are the elements of godliness you relate to, what are the elements that you don't relate to, but there's still something, what are the elements that are higher than that. So really the challenge is, how do you find in your life the Heskim, the Shakvataria, the Hechlota, meaning the consideration, the deliberation, the determination, then the Ratzon Prati, which is the details and the pursuit, and then finally how God actually allocates resources and the process of creation. So really that's our challenge, to find all those levels in relation to ourselves. And that will be where you're at. For you to start trying to figure out, okay, so what's the difference between how it's after the Tzimtzum or before the Tzimtzum? It's good discussion. I'm happy to discuss it and happy to find even differences in our Aveda there. But the real way to begin is by first finding where you stand. What's your b'chol levavcha, what's your b'chol nafshecha, and what's your b'chol moedecha? So moed is already beyond, and levavcha nafshecha is more internal. So that's what it comes down to, moving from the pnimi to the makif be'etzem, all the way to the highest levels of transcendence. So that's why, that's the place you really want to relate to, because then you can internalize it. Without that, it becomes really an academic discussion, which we went through. That's why I brought the letter of the Rebbe, that Lifnei Tzimtzum, it's all about divine consciousness. Achrat Tzimtzum, you're already relating to existence, but even as it relates to existence, there's levels that are beyond existence, even in the state of Hishtalshlus, which is, as I said, even in the area of Asiya. What's the difference between the 10 spheres of Asiya and Keser of Asiya? The 10 spheres is the actual building blocks of the immanent energy that shapes the world of Asiya, this lowest of worlds. And the Keser is the Ratzon Hashem in the shape, in the desire for those specific details on this level. So every level has Pnimi and Makif and higher levels of Makif as deep as you can go. And then you move to the next level. So yes, we could discuss the seichel of it, the difference how it is in Asiya, how it is in Yetzirah, how it is in Bria, how it is in Atzilus, how it is in Akudim, how it is in Ak, and how it is Lifnei Tzimtzum. But the first step is really to find, relating to you where you are, how you relate to these different levels. And then you can talk about What is the Atzilus, the Asiya within you, and the Yitzira within you, and the Bria, and the Atzilus, and Akudim, Ak, and Lifnei Atzimtzum. So I could go into more detail, but I'd rather just suffice to say what I've said right now, because that's the key to my view, finding those letters, and then you can start thinking how you can climb and go to deeper and deeper levels. Just to use an example, you say, for example, on Shavuos, there's an Aveda, a Korban, that's Kulei LaHashem, Korban Elah. Kulei LaHashem, meaning the whole Korban is Lachme Le'ishai, and the human being does not in any way participate in it. Then you have sometimes it's Mechza LaHashem and Mechza LaAdam, meaning a human being, after he brings the Korban, can eat from it. Sometimes the Kohanim eat from it. And Chassidus explains, we learn about this regarding, I think, Shavuos is an example, and there's other places. So what does that mean? There are times you do an Aveda, that your Aveda is only about God. Your job is to be mevatel, to nullify and to selflessly submit to whatever Hashem wants. But then there's an Aveda where Hashem says, I want you also to partake in it. For example, Shabbos. We know Shabbos is Kulei LaHashem, right? Shabbos LaHashem, Einig, v'karasa l'Shabbos Einig, mekatsha v'kaima. The seventh day of the week comes, and it's a divine day. And yet, it's not like Yom Kippur, where we serve God through fasting.
There's more going on down there. Yeah.
Can you put it on silent, please?
Oh, I'm sorry.
So Shabbos is clearly a day, Shabbos LaHashem, completely dedicated to God. And yet, it's not like Yom Kippur where you fast and you deprive yourself of physical pleasure. On Shabbos, it's a mitzvah, through Achila and Shtiyah, Suda Shabbos, and all the other things that are considered einik. Why? Because the Eibishter wants that your serving me should also include your participation, and you should also have pleasure in it. La'angi Beis is the Lashon. You should take pleasure in God. Okay. But then there's an Aveda like Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur, no. Yom Kippur, you have to fast, and the Hayinuyim, the 5 different afflictions, and you try to be as much as possible angelic. We don't eat, we don't drink, we don't do other physical pleasures. Why? Because here's a day where we're asked to lift ourselves up to a higher state. So is this a contradiction? No. Both Avedas are necessary. One, the mile of Shabbos is, it's a godliness, but it's also on our terms. We're part of it. And there's others where we're supposed to completely suspend ourselves in order to absorb Elokus. In different Asias, in Aveda, that's the difference between, are you relating to God on God's terms, or you're relating to God on your terms and God's terms. So there are things where Hashem says, here's something where I come more bislapshus, more relating to you. It's still godly. And there are things that are almost purely godly, and we are just being absorbed by a higher experience. Just to point out, there are things where we want godliness as it relates to existence. That's already like a rotzen, and more than a rotzen, the levels that relate to existence, and then there's levels that are beyond existence. So that would be an example of the level that before it becomes a shayach la'elamis, or consideration, where it's only a touch he's considering. So you see from this, and there's many, obviously, levels in between. Many levels in between. There are mitzvahs, for example, that if you don't have a kavanah l'Hashem, the mitzvah is puzzle. Like that would be a korban. You don't have the right kavanah when you bring an offering, the korban is puzzle. By tzedakah, the other extreme. Obviously, with kavanah, tzedakah is better. A good intention, l'shema, and you smile to a person. But tzedakah, even if you're doing it in a way that's completely selfish, for your own interests, and there's no kavanah at all, and even a kavanah shalei l'shema, it's the Eibishter says, you mekayim the mitzvah, you have it. My point is that you see there are mitzvahs where you're much more going into God's domain and the mitzvahs that are more on our level, and there's still a mitzvah, but each case by case. And if you go through different mitzvahs, you find there are mitzvahs that a kavana will help, a mitzvah where a kavana is necessary, and so on. So really, I'm just giving examples of finding different levels of how we relate to godliness on God's terms or on our terms or something in between, and depending what level. So then when you think of it that way, then all these levels we're discussing are not just God is considering and then he decides he's going to do it. No, these are actually handles that we can relate to God in different ways. Just like we can relate to the artist, not just to the art, but to the artist and to the levels, deepest levels in the artist, even before he began to determine, even before he began to consider creating art. That's what I wanted to add. And just as a summary of everything we're discussing here.
Rabbi Jacobson.
Yeah.
Good morning. Question about that. This process that we go through, and basically I would assume that's in every level of Ratzon, at different Kesarim and throughout the different worlds, in Ak and lower. Is the Heskom, is that still being made about the original Heskom, or is this process of these 3 or 4 different levels, the Heskom, Meshachlet, V'tarya, and Hachlata, and then the implementation, is that on different, the content of that is different, or the Eibusher, so to speak, revisits the original Heskom, but in a lower level? Or is it a whole different Heskom that now he's talking about how I make Atzilus or whatever, the different material, or as it goes back to the original discussion, consideration, divine consciousness of whether I should, have a relationship at all with a creation and so on and so forth?
It's a good question. My answer would be both, to be honest. I think both are true. For example, when it talks about in Siddur, the Siddur im Dach, the Mittler Rebbe, the Maimorim of the Alter Rebbe, the Mittler Rebbe gathered, he speaks what happens Erev Rosh Hashanah, something the Rebbe cites very often. So it says, Chozer Ritzeinei L'Kidkad Musei, which means everything goes back to its primordial original state, all the way to the highest levels. And you need to be me'erer and awaken from the root, from the source itself, the process of the Ratzon of Ano Emlech, that I will rule over you, that God's Ratzon for existence. So what does that mean? Most people think, when you think of it simply, it means, you know what? The contract has expired. So let's say you have a contract with someone. It comes now Erev Rosh Hashanah, the last day of Elul. Contract has expired. And what are you doing? You're in trepidation and fear. What happens if the investor doesn't want to invest again? He'll say, you know what? Contract's over. I'm not renewing the contract. That's how, on an ostensible level, you'd think it's what's going on. But that never happened. God didn't renew the contract. Since Tov Shin Pei, now we're talking about 5,780 years, God always renews the contract. So what does it mean? What is it, a game? You're just telling us? We know it's going to be renewed. We all know Rosh Hashanah is coming, that the world's not going to stop to exist. Rosh Hashanah Tov Shin Pei Aleph. So what is it? Why are we being told this? So if you think about it, it's a very profound thought. Obviously, God can stop the contract anytime he wants. He can stop in the middle of the year too, frankly. You're going to sue him? What are you going to do? So the point I'm making here is, so what's the deeper meaning? The deeper meaning actually is a mile. It's not a chsarn. It's not like we tremble all day. Maybe he's not going to renew it. It's God wants to renew it, but he wants it to come back from the original place. It's like a relationship, like a marriage. You don't want it to be mechanical and automatic pilot. You want to renew it. But the Ragat Shavar once said that Kedushin, Chasana, because you're bringing together two opposites, a male and female, Kosher Kakriyas Yamsuf, the Gemara says, it's as difficult as parting the sea. So just like when God parted the sea, he needed to have all night, he needed to have the wind blowing to keep the waters like a wall. So he said that whenever there's two opposites come together, it's not a one-time bringing them together. Every second it has to be renewed. It's called a pa'ula nimshachas, a perpetual connection. So Rab Chaim Brisker, when he heard the Rogatchover tell him this chiddush, says, if that's the case, Mazel Tov. Why are you telling me Mazel Tov? I was married 26 years, whatever, many years ago. So he said, because you just said every second is new. So now it's a new Mazel Tov, every second of your marriage. The Rogatchover, this is how I heard the end of the story. Some say that's not correct, this end. Rogatchover said, but the Mazel Tov is also a pull in Shachas. So once you said it, then it really extends every day. I don't know if that's correct or not, but the point is that the renewal by Rosh Hashanah is because God wants, I want to have a relationship with you from my source. I don't want to just, I've invested in creation. So the levels of Elokus that relate to creation are there, and that's it. Every year of Rosh Hashanah, we go back and we have the opportunity on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur to go all the way into the Atzmus itself and arouse anew the process. So based on that, I would say that even after the Tzimtzum, there's also that type of element of, I don't want to say reconsideration, but it's a lakus that even after the Tzimtzum, you also have a lakus that just considering existence, which means a lakus that's really beyond existence, and it's just beginning the stirring until you get to the point of deliberation and determination. So I think throughout Ishtalshalis, those levels continue to repeat themselves again and again. Rosh Hashanah obviously is a one-time, once a year, where it really is prominent. But the truth is, it's happening all the time. Every morning when you wake up, it's a mini Rosh Hashanah. You say Moed Ani Lefanecha is the form of Rosh Hashanah, of Kabbalah Sel Malchus Shamayim. I acknowledge you giving me my soul, Shechzata bin Nishmasi, in a sense, that type of renewal. So the point is, my answer to you is both. That there's elements that are lower levels, but there's also, I believe, like a microcosm, macrocosm of everything happening. Lifnei Tzimtzum happens la'achrat Tzimtzum. However, it's in the lower level. Just like we say there are 10 spheres in Asiya, there are 10 spheres in Yetzirah, and 10 spheres in Bria. It's 10 spheres in each one of them. It's a microcosm of what is on a higher level, but it's in a lower dimension. So the same levels, like Chesed of Atzilus, Chesed of Bria, Chesed of Yitzirah, Chesed of Asiya, all have one thing in common, Chesed, but they're very different types of Chesed. Chesed of Atzilus is pure Likus. It's God's Chesed. Bria is already a Chesed that has somewhat of a creation, the creation or the creature's relationship with it. In Asiya, Chesed is human Chesed. Now you could align it to Atzilus Chesed. My point is, all the levels in general, Shalshus are like a hologram, and they repeat themselves, but on a different plane. Okay. Good.
You could say it's not only in Rosh Hashanah. Now I'm talking Lifnei Tzimtzum. On Rosh Hashanah, it's in a higher level or what? But every minute it happens.
Yeah, in a chanami, but that's the same thing. You say I'm a chadash betuva b'chol yom tamid ma'aser bereishis. You say I'm a chadash betuva b'chol yom tamid ma'aser bereishis. That God renews existence every minute, every day, every minute, every second. And yet we still say there's a renewal that happens on Rosh Hashanah. The answer is Rosh Hashanah is a chadash. It's not just chidush hayoshenis. It's a new dimension. But it's true. Everything happens on microcosm and macrocosm. But Rosh Hashanah still has the potency of Rosh Hashanah. It's still not, you can't just say every second is like Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah does have some overall renewal, just like Yom Kippur has something that's unique to it. As a matter of fact, it says in Chassidus that all Kabbalah sale throughout the year comes from Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah is like the mokir for that will then extend each day. The same idea, but on a smaller scale. The same is true with everything. Yitzias Mitzrayim is every second. But still Pesach is the full-blown, like the Rebbe says, that's the shar. That's when the whole experience is in its fullest sense and renewed the whole idea in its prominent way. Yeah.
So that, according to what you just said there, it would seem like Rosh Hashanah is going back to the investors and asking for a new round of investment, whereas maybe the process after Tzimtzum is he's already decided that he's giving you $10 million, whatever it is, and that he's just now deciding, and within Ratzon, Heskom and Shachlataya, how you're going to spend the money. How you're going to what's already allocated. only once a year do we go back and see if he wants to, totally, commit a new investment. But once he's made that decision, we think that not every time does an investor consider, once he's made a decision to invest, he's already invested. But it doesn't mean that, so it seemed like according to that analogy.
You could explain it that way. As a matter of fact, if you learn Kuntur Samayon, and based on earlier Maimonim, they asked that question. On one hand, it says, Mizanesav Shel Adam, that the person's parnasa is determined on Rosh Hashanah. Another day, it says that every day we pray for parnasa. So how do you explain it? Is it every day that is determined, or is it determined on Rosh Hashanah? So there he explains essentially that Rosh Hashanah, you have the Ratzon Klali, that you'll be blessed in a certain way, but it doesn't give the details, and it could change and so on. So there's Maimorim that talk about this at length, the difference between the din of mishpat of Rosh Hashanah and the din of mishpat on a daily basis, which relates a little to what you mentioned, and the different explanations for this. In Kuntur Samayin, it's at length, and it's earlier, it's from the Alter Rebbe, it starts, it talks about this subject.
Awesome.
Okay. Okay, now let us go. I'm going to read further now. So what do we say now? So on top of 83, well, I'm going to start from the bottom of 82, and here's what he says. So after explaining the different levels of Ratzon, and each one as they relate more and more to existence, he says, V'akolhu b'ha'er ein sof shalifnei tzimtzum. All these levels we discussed are all in the divine consciousness of the divine energy pre-tzimtzum. The b'chlolusay, in general, hainu klolos er shalifnei tzimtzum. In general, that er lifnei tzimtzum, who er akol batzmusay canal. In general, all the levels, despite the fact that we said within them there's itself different levels, but in general, all of it is kol batzmusay, meaning all it is reflecting essentially atzmus's interest. Except that gufa, and here he qualifies. However, within this energy itself, yesh beis madreges. There's two levels. Now, these two levels were not mentioned until now. They were mentioned in Ayin Beis. That's why you may be familiar with them, because we learned them already on page 1149. But they were not mentioned till now. Till now, we just spoke about Ur. If you remember, we said Ur was Ayin, and Ayin breaks into two levels. But he didn't spell out what those two levels are. Now he's going to explain what the two levels of Ayin are. Remember, the whole thing began Yesh, Ayin, Yesh, and the Ayin has two stages. So what are the two levels? Etzem Ha'er, Vispashtus Ha'er. I'm just looking at the Ayin Beis to see the language there. Yeah. So Frierdiker Rebbe is tying it all up based on page 1149 in Ayin Beis. So Etzem Ha'er, which means the essence of the Ur, and Ispashtus is the extension of the Ur. So here's the thing that you need to keep in mind. Generally, we speak about Ur, we speak about Etzem and Ur. The essence, the source, and Ur, the reflection of the source. In context, let's say, of the sun. The Etzem HaShemesh and Ur HaShemesh. So Etzem HaShemesh is the sun itself, the luminary called the sun, a moir, and the Ur is Hispashtus Ha'er, which is the extension. What comes out of the sun? Light. Light that travels all the way to Earth, the sunlight that we see, that creates daylight and that warms this planet, etc., etc. However, Chassidus goes deeper and says in Ur itself, there's also Etzem Ha'er and Hispashtus Ha'er. I'm spelling it out because people have asked me also when we learned here, it can get confusing because suddenly using the word Etzem and Ur. We know is not etzem. As a matter of fact, in the beginning of this whole subject matter, on page 1147 in Ayin Beis, and on page, give me a minute, and on page 51 in Sadik Daled, he said clearly that the etzem bilti mispashet, the etzem, that all levels are in not in etzem, because the etzem is just a core etzem. He said it clearly. And he said that is subject to shifts and changes and diminishment, like the avuka, as he discussed, if you remember, the light of a torch. So the torch is the source, but the light of the torch gets more diminished as you go away, distant. If you're 5 feet away, is different than when you're 50 feet away from it. And yet, he now introduces in Eir itself, there's a thing called Etzem Eir and Ispashtus Eir. I'm going to read it inside, and then I'll explain. Because we have to understand, if Eir is not Etzem, why do you call it Etzem Eir? Now, obviously, the answer is, in Eir itself, there's the Etzem of Eir, and there's the extension of Eir when you break it down. So really, you have Atzmi, Etzem, then you have Eir. In Eir, you have Etzem of Eir, and you have the Ispashtus of Eir. So he says, here's the difference. The Ispashtus Eir, hu b'bchinas hamshacha v'gilui. The extension, the expression of light. Hispashtus literally means extension, spreading out, but it could also mean expression. That is the state of hamshacha v'gili. Hamshacha means it's being transmitted, and v'gili, and being revealed. Uboy shayach lemer, and in that level of extension and expression, you could say the kol mashu mispashet yeser mismayet eirei. That the more it extends, the more the light gets diminished. What's he referring to? He's referring to back to page 51. If you go back to page 51 in Sadik Dalet, he said exactly those words. He said, and he said that's the difference between an atzmi and a non-atzmi. If you don't remember, I definitely tell you, go back there, because this is the end. Page 83 here is the end of this so-called sugya, this topic that began on page 51. Not the end of the whole subject, obviously. So 51, that's what he said. The whole Ratzon was coming to explain the levels in Eir, that Eir is subject to levels. So he's saying that what we said, that Eir is subject to levels, is Hispashtus Eir. Eir as it extends. He's qualifying and saying that Etzem Eir is not subject. You'll see. So that's what he says. There you could say, the more it extends, the more diminished it gets, because that's its personality. Like you see with sunlight. The sunlight closer to the sun is far more intense than the sunlight that reaches Earth. That's his pastor said. Hainu, shenasa yesus shaychus ela elmus. This is the key line, what I kept on elaborating on before. This isn't just a matter of mechanics, that the light is more diminished. What does it mean? It means it's getting closer, has more relationship to existence. So the fact that if there was no Eir, we wouldn't have a logical way. Remember the point I've made many times. Atzmus can do whatever he wants. He can create existence. Poof, you have Yesh HaNivra and a world like ours. But then you would have no way of understanding how that happened. With the seichel that we have today, we have no way of understanding how God relates to us, because then he doesn't relate to us. He created existence. God can do a kol yochel. He does whatever he wants. And we'd have no way of retracing the steps. Like he said in the previous page, a dugma, we'd have nothing to relate to. But the fact that God said and chose that the atzmus should give off light, which is a mashal, of course, that there should be some form of expressive energy, extended energy, reflecting the etzem. Remember, Kol ha'inyan of Eir is reflecting its source. It doesn't have any identity of its own. But what's changed is now you have a level that's subject to our relationship. Because the Eir, by definition, can be more and more diminished, can get closer and closer to relate to existence. So this way, if you didn't have Eir, you'd have to say, my relationship with Atzmos, God says I have a relationship with him, but I have no clue how it works. So someone will say, is that a relationship? God basically made the relationship, said you have a relationship, but you have no idea how to relate to him. By creating Ur, God basically created a canvas, or as I said, a field of energy, that here, these levels that can begin, higher levels are taka beyond existence, but as the Ur gets diminished, so to speak, and diminished here doesn't mean physically diminished. It means not with the quite same intensity, and not focused only on what Atzmus wants. The Ur can relate more and more to existence, even though it's still Ur.
Is the Hispashtus a Yerido לגבי the עצם? Hispashtus oil an עצם oil.
Generally speaking, you'd call it a Yerida, yeah. But Yerida doesn't always mean a bad thing. So here's the example. If a great king decided that he has subjects, we are his subjects. A great Rebbe, a great king, lives in his palace, and he gives off edicts and commands, and they end up by us, and we're told this is what you should be doing today, tomorrow, and so on. So you get the message, maybe a baskel from heaven, from the palace emerges a sound, a voice. We don't understand it, but the voice says, your job today is to do this and this. This is your shlichus. Someone will say to you, do you fulfill what the king asks you? You say, yeah, it's the king. Do you know anything about this king? No. It's a mysterious king. You never see him. You never relate to him. You never understand him. He's living in his palace, but he's sending us messages. What would be the relationship? It would be one completely Kabbalah sale. I accept whatever God says or the king says, and that's that. However, let's talk about a different scenario, which is reality. The king has a Mishnah Lamelech. He has a second in command, a viceroy. And he has a chief of staff. And he has all kinds of positions, the Sar HaBetochen and the Sar HaKsofim and the Sar. He has ministers, a minister of finance and a minister of secretary of state, the secretary of defense, the secretary of commerce, or whatever it's called, etc., etc. He has a whole bunch of departments, heads of departments. Each of them have sub-departments. Each of them have heads of the sub-departments, and it's a whole establishment. And each one of them has their role is to respond to the issues of the people. In other words, let's say you have an issue with, you want me to pay taxes, I have questions. In the first scenario, it's Atzmus, the Melech is removed from everything. He's sending us instructions, commands. The second one is it creates a whole structure. We can relate to this structure. You have someone to speak to, someone that's more on your terms. If that doesn't work, you go to a supervisor. If the supervisor doesn't work, you go to the supervisor. There's recourse, and there's a full functioning system. Now, God could have created existence very differently, but this is the way he created it, that we relate to a system. We relate that we have someone to go to. I have a father, a mother. I have a teacher. I have a principal. There's a hierarchy. And that hierarchy creates a structure that we can relate to on our terms. So basically what I'm saying is, if God did not make Oyer, it was Atzmos and then creation, you'd have nothing to hold on to. There would be no relationship, to go back to that word again. Oyer is the place, so to speak, because it's a reflection of the divine and not the essence itself. On the other hand, it's nothing but the essence, because all it is reflecting what the king wants. Remember, all these departments, we're talking about in a healthy government or a healthy corporation, they're all listening to the boss. They're all following the orders of the top authority. In this case, Oyer is completely dedicated and bottled to the Moed, to Atzmus. So it follows its instructions. But Oyer is a place where we can then say, okay, now I have something I can hold on to. It's a Metzias Nimtza, like we're Metzias Nimtza. It's not built to Metzias Nimtza. It's not Atzmus, Metziasim Atzmusei, Mechuyev HaMetzias. all the terms we learned much earlier in this mimer, these maimorim, that showed us how God is completely beyond us. The Yesh Amiti is a true and absolute reality, but you know what? There's nothing about that reality that we can even relate to. Yes, it's true that he created the Yesh Anivra with a certain element of Mitzusi Matzmuse, but that's, one specific detail. It's not a full relationship. It means that this existence reflects a certain element of Atzmus, but that's not meaning that you have a relationship with Atzmus. Whereas Oyer, on the other hand, as we spoke, reflects everything Atzmus wants, but it's now a let's call it I don't want to use the word institutionalized or establishment because it's still before the Tzimtzum, but you could say it's the beginnings of a logical structural system. And again, logic is also not the right word to use because there's no logic yet. It's a structural system that we, in some way or other, can relate to. And that's why I think the Frierdiker Rebbe in the previous page, I was thinking about it a lot. Why did he elaborate about Mipsari Erze Elaka? For my flesh I behold God, and we created in the divine image. Because he wanted to tell us that God embedded and implanted within us a system that reflects his system. It's not complete because we said Erze, it's not seeing it with your full vision, but a snapshot of it, an image of it, some reflection of it we get. That's what he said. We can have a hashara. We could get a sense and a depiction of what it's like. So point being is that we have now a whole structural system of all these levels of Ratzon that we could speak about. And not only that, we can relate to, because he gave examples how we ourselves go through these levels. First there's Etzem HaNefesh, and then there's a consideration, and then there's a deliberation and a determination, and then you pursue it, and there's details, etc., etc. So that's essentially what Oyer is. Oyer is this field of energy. One second. Do me a favor. Let me finish this before you. One second. So Oyer is this so-called environment, if you wish, divine environment or divine consciousness, where all this begins to play itself out. And like he said in his pastures, there you could say, there's Shayach Leimer, that the more it extends, the more it gets diminished. Remember, it never loses its properties of light. It's always still a reflection of Atzmus. However, it becoming relating more. Like I said before, the chief of staff relates to the source, but the heads of the departments, and especially their subordinates, are relating to us. They come and deal with the people. So they will come to each town and to each individual, and you could speak to them and relate to them. But they're still representing the source. They're just an Oyer that has now come closer and relates, like he says, more shayches ala elamus, using that example. Now he's going to talk about Etzem.
If the Oyer is a reflection of the Atzmus built in Metzius, how could it be that the Oyer is a Metzius Nimtzo?
The Oyer is, who said the Oyer is built in Metzius? It's exact opposite. What you just said, if you don't mind, silence it because there's too much background noise. The exact opposite is correct. Oyer is a Metzius Nimtza. Because it's bottled to the Moel, it also can carry the concept of built in Metzius. But where does it say Oyer is built in Metzius Nimtza? There's never such a thing. Only
no, my question is, since Oyer is a Metzius Nimtza, how could it be? I hear, but if it's a reflection...
One second. There's only one God.
I agree. But all the Meshalim that you gave with the king, with the vice, with the chief of staff, the king himself is also a Metzius Nimtza. But here, Atzmus is a built-in Metzius. How could Oyer become a Metzius Nimtza if it's a reflection of a built-in Metzius?
You're telling me Atzmus does not have the capacity to create a Metzius Nimtza?
Atzmus could do everything, but we're talking
exactly.
the way we
That's
should
what
understand.
He did. And that's what he did. That's exactly what he did. He created a Metzius Nimtza called Oyer. That's exactly what he did.
So that's not a logical thing. This is
it's very
Atzmus.
No, because you don't know what, I see you don't know what built-in Metzius Nimtza is. Built-in Metzius Nimtza does not, you have to silence. I can't hear myself. There's too much background. Bilta Mitzias Nimtza, if you know what it means, you would never ask such a question. Bilta Mitzias Nimtza is not bound by anything. That's exactly what it means. It does not exist in any way we can understand existence. And Bilta Mitzias Nimtza can absolutely, and has, he wants an existence that's Mitzias Nimtza. And that existence begins with Oyer. Now it happens to be because Oyer is bottled to Atzmus, it can carry the built Mitzias Nimtza of Atzmus, but it carries it, not that it becomes it. Oyer is never, there's only one Atzmus, built Mitzias Nimtza Atzmus, one Mechuyev HaMitzias, one Mitziusim Atzmusei, Atzmus. Atzmus Nesava Kodesh Baruch Hu Lias Le'dir B'Tachtenim. He desired, it does not, yes, there's no logic because there's no seichel yet. He desired an existence called the Mitzias Nimtza that will ultimately be Tachtenim. He wants it to be as logical as possible. How do you get from the highest levels of Elikus to Tachtenim? So you begin with Oyer, which is a Mitzias Nimtza. It's a existence, but it's only bottled, it's completely reflecting its source. But we know, we learned that length, or that Atzmus can't even be called a Moyer. You can't say that's not all of Atzmus to give off Oyer. And even that Oyer reveals the fact that what I reveal of Atzmus is not all of Atzmus. That's also from Oyer. So Oyer basically is the perfect interface that we can relate to. At the same time, it's completely bottled and reflective of Atzmus. And I discussed Oyer at length in previous classes. So if you want to go back to them, you'll probably get more clarity. But the bottom line is that Oyer is the first Mitzias Nimtza that's reflective of Atzmus, but it's not Atzmus, obviously. And there's many things in Atzmus that Oyer does not relate to, and Oyer only due to its bittul, it can carry it, but it doesn't relate to it. That's why he said a whole agrichas, what a yesh does, what Oyer does. So Oyer is essentially Mitzias Nimtza that can reflect and carry even higher things. But frankly, he's not even talking about Bilta Mitzias Nimtza here. We talked about that a while back, a few weeks ago. So I would basically refer you back to that discussion because I don't want to go over that whole discussion again. It'll just distract because here we already went through that. So I would just go back to those classes. If you want to listen to them again, you probably get more clarity. So bottom line is Oyer is a Mitzias Nimtza. It's reflective, it's reflecting what Atzmus is. In this case, Atzmus wants the Oyer, Hispashtus Oyer, to be subject to diminishment, which it is because of this nature. And it will ultimately go level by level as it gets more relationship to Elmas. But now let's talk about Etzem Oyer. Etzem Oyer is a very interesting entity. Because on one hand, we're going to learn it's Oyer, but it's the etzem of what Oyer is about. So it's not Oyer as it relates to its function, which is to extend and to be nimshach and gilui. Its Oyer is only to reflect Atzmus. So basically, etzem Oyer is Oyer, but its only element is that it's reflecting its source. Hispashtus Oyer is reflecting the source, but as the source wants and is interested in creating. Etzem Oyer is like the Oyer within the sun. That's why we called it Eira Kol Batzmusei. Not Mamish Eira Kol Batzmusei, that's Yechelis. But basically, all it is, like he said, is not anything but reflecting its source. And the reason for this, we learned at length as well, because we want to have a Mitzias Nimtza. We want to have something in our form of existence that is completely and totally and exclusively dedicated to its source. So he says, Aval Etzem Oyer Ein B'chinas Hamshacha V'Gilui, is not in the form of transmission and revelation. So then what makes it Oyer? The answer is because it's not Atzmus. That's the only thing that makes it Oyer. It's not Atzmus Mamish. It's the Oyer of Atzmus, but it does not have any Hamshach and Gilid. So, like he says, V'hainu D'liyese Oyer Bilvad. That it is, all it is Oyer Bilvad. I just want to see the language in Ayin Beis, just to see how the Frierdiker Rebbe is. The Rebbe Rashab, I'm just reading the Rebbe Rashab's language. It may be helpful. So I'm turning now to page 1149 in Ayin Beis. If you have it, you can look at it. If not, I'll just read a few lines. He says, he goes like this. Aval atzmos ha'er einu b'chinas hamshacha klal. V'gam keshenimshechu kamoi shehu be'etzem. And then he goes on and says, "Ubechlolus hu b'chinas er bilvad, u'lechen shayach b'ze etzem v'yispashtus, rak she'etzem ha'eru kamoi ha'atzmo she'en b'chinas hamshacha." And Hispashtus says, "B'chinas hamshacha." Okay, just looking at it to help understand the lines here. So he says like this. I'm not sure why the Frierdiker Rebbe took out some of the lines from Ayin Beis, but I think when you learn it Ayin Beis, it's a little easier to understand, at least when I looked at it right now. Unless there's some lines missing. Let me just see again. 1 second. Yep. I'll be honest with you. I'm just looking in Ayin Beis now, and on page 1148, as well as on 1149, the Rebbe Rashab says a lot more about Etzem Ha'er than the Frierdiker Rebbe cites. So if you really want to, we really want to understand that, I would go back to Ayin Beis now, because I'm looking at this at the Tzadik Daled, and it seems like it's very, very short and brief. I'm not sure. Usually, the Frierdiker Rebbe would not only cite the Ayin Beis, he'd add to it. And here, he actually did not cite certain key lines. I'm not sure why. That I don't understand. But if you have the Ayin Beis, I want to refer to a few lines before I continue reading in Tzadik Daled. Because remember, the Tzadik Daled is based on Ayin Beis. So on page 1148, if you have it, I'll tell you what line I'm looking at. It's interesting that he does not bring that. Really surprising, actually. Not sure why. Interesting. Anyway, on page 1148, the Rebbe Rashab says the following. Unless I missed them. 1 second, let me just see one more thing. So just bear with me. I'm just looking at the earlier discussion here. I want to correct myself. Actually, the 1148 is cited earlier on page 57. So fine, that clarifies something that I was wondering. He actually does bring these two levels of Eir already earlier on page 57. So if you look on page 57, he says that there's two levels in there. She'einu b'chinas shaychus klal el b'chinas atzmi. Yeah. Yeah. And then there's this Pashtus Sa'ir. So Frierdiker Rebbe already spoke about these two levels. And there he said, Ba'ir hazeh shayach leim hageder ha'omer ba'ir dekol mashim mispasher v'nimshech mismayet eireh. Okay. And that's where the Ratzon emerges. So fine. Yeah, and yet on page 1149, he does say a few lines here. Okay. So let's go back. I'm back to Tzadik Dalet now. He says like this. So in Ayin Beis, he says, Ein Hamshacha v'Gilui, he adds the words, V'gam kishenimshachu k'moishu be'etzem, which means even as the Oir Atzmi is somewhat of something is there, it's like it is in its Etzem level, which means it's not subject to Hamshacha and Gili. All it is a reflection of its source. And he says, U'b'chlolos u'b'chinas Eir bolvad, which is what the Frierdiker Rebbe is saying here. V'hainu d'liyeshe Eir bolvad. So what is he saying with that? That on one hand, it's not subject to any transmission or revelation. All it is a reflection of its source, like he said before on page, as I just referred to, page 57, sorry. On the other hand, it is already oir. And that's why, because it's air, you can talk about levels. One is etzem ha'er, and the second level is ispashtus ha'er. So in air itself, it's an air that doesn't radiate. It's the etzem of air. But it's not the etzem of etzem. It's not atzmus. In air itself is the essential element of being a reflection of its source. Hispashtus ha'er is already the reflection relating to what it's going to lead to. The etzem, meaning ha'etzem ha'er hu k'moya atzmus. The etzem of it is like atzmus. She'einu b'chinas hamshacha v'hispashtus. It's not in the form of extension, or expression, or expansion. Aval eir hu b'chinas hamshacha. But pashtus, he means here aval hispashtus ha'er.
You're right that in page 57, he is going with details that makes it much more clear.
Right, that's why I stopped. I really say that we have to look at the Ayin Beis. I'm not sure why, but there seems to be, like right now he says, he just said, he says, da etzem u k'moya atzmus. Etzem ha'er is like atzmus, she'ein b'chinas hamshacha v'hispashtus. Aval eir hu b'chinas hamshacha. He has to mean hispashtus ha'er. But he only says oir. So you have to say it's hispashtus ha'er. In Ayin Beis, the language is like this. U'b'chlolos u'b'chinas eir bolvad, u'lechen shayach b'zeh etzem v'hispashtus. Since it's oir, it's only oir, not atzmus. That's why you could have a core of oir and extension. Rak she'etzem ha'er hu k'moya atzmus she'ein b'chinas hamshacha. The etzem ha'er is like atzmus that's not in a state of transmission. V'hainu she'ein ba'in hamshacha li b'chinas miyut, which means it does not relate. It doesn't have within it any type of transmission that you can say there's a diminishment within it, and ub'chinas shaychus ala elmus v'ishtalshlus, that it has some relationship to the worlds and to the cosmic order. Kol etzem shebilti mispashet debilti mischalak. So this etzem is like every etzem that does not extend and does not not divided. The extension of light is already in a form of transmission. Okay, so as I explained at length when we learned Ayin Beis and when we learned page 57, and I'll say it now again. So here's the subtle key thing to remember. Oir, Etzema Eir is simply the shift where Atzmus is now extended, created an extension called a Metzias Nimtza of Oir. That's all it is. It's nothing to do with existence. It has nothing to do with anything. All it is the reflection of Atzmus's desire to have a Metzias Nimtza. Then from that Oir will come another Oir, which will be his Pashtus Oir, which is not focused entirely on Atzmus. It's focused on Atzmus's wish that now you should start relating. And that Oir is subject to diminishment as it begins extending. You can basically say the first level of light is the light within the sun. The second level of light is the light already outside of the sun. Now, obviously, everything here is within the sun, as the Alter Rebbe says, but relatively speaking, it's basically two elements of God's desire. One is to have a reflection of himself, and other, a reflection that is going to be subject to diminishment, where the rotzen, where the heskim will emerge, and then the liberation, and then the determination, etc.
Maybe it's the same level, even though the two different functions, but it's at the same level. The oil is having the not ispashtus, and it has also the inyan of ispashtus. Could be.
Well,
No.
the thing is on the first line of this page. The first line of this page, it says, Beis Madreges, Etzem Eir v'Ispashtus Eir. So he says two levels. You want to explain it? You can explain it however you want to explain it. But there are two levels. Obviously, it's coming from one Eir. It's not two different tracks. Just like I said, if you don't mind, if everybody can mute. If you're not speaking, please mute because it's impossible to hear. There's too much background. Obviously, we're talking about, when I said the sunlight within the sun and the light outside of the sun, it's the sunlight outside of the sun is coming from the sunlight within the sun. So obviously, Hispashtus Eir is the extension of Etzema Eir. But they are two levels and two different states. Where Etzema Eir is referring to the Eir, all it is reflecting the source, like he said back on page 57. And Hispashtus Eir is already an Eir that's subject to diminishment. So I would say there are two levels, exactly like you said, Beis Madreges, and that's that. Beis Madreges be'er. The Eir she'einu b'chinas shaychus klal al elmis, it's called Eir Atzmi. And the Eir that's beginning to have some relationship or considering relationship is going to be Hispashtus Eir.
It's like you said, he said Beis Madrego, he said not Beis Inyonim.
Yeah.
Rabbi Jacobson, it says on 1148 that Kayadua or Makif Eino Bechinas Yetzia Mina Atzmus. So what does that mean? That how we have Or Makif even in the lower worlds, but there it says it doesn't go out of Atzmus, this Or Makif.
If you read the whole thing, he says, because there's etzem of makif and there's how makif comes in the shtalshlus.
I see.
If you read a few lines before, he says,
Mhm.
he'll say before, Omni Yodua, the er makif kameshu be'etzem, hayim b'chinas shaychus klal. Go back a few lines, you'll see.
Okay. Also, when you were saying that Or carries Atzmus, it doesn't have a relationship to it, but it carries it. Because otherwise we'd only be dealing with the chief of staff, so we'd never get to have a relationship with Hashem himself, the Melech. But
Right.
is that being carried by Etzem Or, because that doesn't have Hispashtus, right? So would that Atzmus is being carried by Or, it's being carried in that lower level, Ispashis or?
It's on all levels of Ur, except it's much more intense and more revealed in the highest levels. But remember, Ur is always Me'ein HaMoir. So whatever level of Ur, it's just a question how much is it diluted with other elements. There's the Ur that's relating as well to existence, but all Ur reflects the highest levels. The reason you have Etzema Ur is because even when it becomes Ispashtus Ur, there's still an Etzema Ur within the Ispashtus Ur. You have to always remember that. Etzema Ur is always going to remain. It's just a question of what's more revealed. So in other words, even, excuse me. So even Ispashtus Ur has Etzema Ur within it. Okay?
Yes, and within that, Etzema or as you said earlier, is not Atzmas. So where's this this level of Atzmas that is being
because
carried?
Of its bittul. When something is completely bottled to something else and has no its own identity, it's a carrier of that thing because it doesn't have any other identity.
But is that carrier only Etzema or does it?
I just said all levels of Ur are Ur.
Carry that Etzema.
And every level of Ur has also Etzema Ur in it.
I see. Okay, so Hispashtus or will have Atzmas in it. Awesome.
I don't know. Are you talking mechanics here? What does it mean it has Atzmus in it?
Yes,
Explain to me what means Atzmus in it.
Well,
Tell
because
me what that means.
Because this light that has a relationship with creation, that has a relationship, is I assume it's only Hispashtus.
You're talking about from Atzmus perspective or from our perspective?
From our perspective.
From our perspective, no, the lower levels, we don't relate to the Atzmus in it because we're in a very low level. We relate to Giluyim. So the fact of the matter is when we do our Avodah, and the more selfless we become, the more bittul we have, the more keli we are to higher levels of Elikus. And if the bittul is complete, you can reach the highest levels of Etzema too. But that's going to be up to your Avodah.
And even higher than Etzema or Atzmus Elaine.
Atzmus doesn't need to be reached. Atzmus is not subject to any diminishment or non-diminishment.
Right.
Atzmus is never subject to things that we can relate to. That's the whole point. We relate through Ur, but the bittul of Ur allows us in. Through our bittul, we can connect to levels that are beyond our limited structure.
And through our bittul, does that give us ultimately at the highest level of tzaddikim, or even within ourselves, because kulam tzaddikim, we could get into the chamber of the Melech himself and have a relationship with the Melech himself in that level?
I don't know what that means. Maybe there's no
bittul?
relationship there. Maybe it's only the Melech. Maybe it's just simply completely bottled to him. So I'm not sure what the word relationship means there in that level.
But I thought the idea is
of course, that when you do a mitzvah, it's Atzmus wants you to do that mitzvah. So you're connecting to Atzmus in one way or another. The question is whether it's on your terms or not. That's another discussion. Even if you don't relate to it, when you do a mitzvah, you're fulfilling Atzmus's desire to do a mitzvah. It's not the desire of Ur. Ur doesn't have any desire of its own. So when Torah says, put on tefillin, keep Shabbos, these are Atzmus is telling us to do that. So just by doing it, you're already fulfilling. The question is there a relationship? That comes down to how much bittul you have that you can absorb, what levels of godliness you can absorb.
I understand what Eliezer said. I think that eventually we are reaching Atzmus. We spoke about before in, I don't know.
You heard what I said. I did not respond that way because I just told you what I have to say about that. What do you mean reaching? I told you, when you and a Jew, a simple child makes a bracha, Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam shakol midvarim, you think that touches Atzmus? Of course. So what do you mean reaching out? We reach Atzmus right now when you do a mitzvah. Is that what you're talking about?
From our point of view, our hergish.
What's up? What I just told you, when you do a mitzvah, we're told it's Atzmus wants the dir b'tachtenim, every single mitzvah. Is that what you're referring to?
Right.
No, I'm referring about.
What's up? But hold on, there's two different people, three people speaking. Eliezer asked the question. You have your own thoughts. I have my thoughts. Let's just make.
Eliezer, go ahead. I think I'm joining Eliezer.
We can't all three speak at the same time.
Eliezer, go ahead.
So, Shlomo, with all respect, I would ask you to let Eliezer speak.
Let
him say what he has to say. I'll respond. Then if you have something to add or subtract, you'll feel free to say so. So, I just said to you, when you do a mitzvah, you're connecting to Atzmus, not to Oyer. Oyer is only Oyer. There is no Oyer. Does not command anything. Oyer is all Oyer is a reflection of Atzmus. So when you're asking me a relationship, yes, a little child makes a mitzvah. Atzmus itself is relating to that. However you explain it. So is that what you're referring to? Hello? Okay. Are we done? That's it? Nobody's responding? Okay.
No, oh, I'm sorry.
Fine.
I think that what I'm asking is not just by doing a mitzvah, putting on tefillin or eating matzah, but can we, through our seichel, through learning Hasidus, have an incredible, have a level of makshava that it can reach Atzmus within makshava, like by learning Ayin Beis, the deepest level. Can we ever, if we were truly learning with this, with the ultimate tachlis bittul and knowledge, idea, will we ever have? Could a person ultimately have the key to get in and speak to God Himself with your own thoughts? Meaning, have that kind of relationship with God, not just eating matzah. I have a relationship, but a conscious level of thought within God's, relating to God on a thought level, on a seichel dicha level, makshava a different level. Could you ultimately get to that level?
If you're going with seichel and machshava, you're going to relate to a God that relates to seichel and machshava.
But that's the highest.
The fact that you're asking this question means a relationship that is bound by your seichel and machshava. So you can have, you're not going to have something that's outside of your bounds. So you cannot use your seichel to have a relationship with God that's beyond seichel. So you're going to have to, if you are ready to completely reach those higher levels, you're going to have to reach a level of bittul that's called total mesiras nefesh, that you wouldn't even ask such a question. People who have a connection to Atzmus on the level you're asking would never ask such a question because they're there. You ask the question only when you're not there and you're looking at like some type of prize to win.
Well,
so
I
bottom
guess
line is, utter bittul would never ask such a question. Oyer never asked such a question because it doesn't have an identity of its own. You're asking, since I have an identity and I want my identity to relate to Atzmus, my answer would be is your identity cannot relate to Atzmus. It's going to relate to levels that you allow in. Whatever you're ready to allow in, that's what you'll identify with. Atzmus is something you're going to need to reach such levels of bittul where these questions won't even be asked.
But I hear that because, as you said, always that the key is bittul, tachlis of bittul. You can't have any yesh at all. Otherwise, you would only be relating. You couldn't relate to it. But you have to be submerged into it, completely submerged by it. But I guess what I'm asking is that a Jew with mesiras nefesh in Russia, when he was, running away from the communists, he has that mesiras level, mesiras nefesh level of connecting to Atzmus.
But a child, when a child makes a bracha, is the same thing.
Right. But what I wanted to know is if we learned Ayin Beis deep enough, could we have that?
Anyway, I'm not going to answer differently than what I answered until now. I don't have another answer.
Okay, I hear you.
Anybody wants to add anything?
No, I got what you're saying, but I remember that in Ayin Beis a while ago we learned about something that Seichel cannot reach. But there is something Reusa de Liber, or maybe higher than Reusa de Liber even, that maybe through these things you could reach. There is something like that.
But Rabbi Teitel, I mean, what we've been learning now, as me, is I find it so exciting, and it's really a different level. I mean, I think we're getting up to a level that I personally never experienced in learning Hasidus, and I'm just wondering, we're really getting close to Atzmus, and I want to know if we could ever enter it, I guess. So that was my question. But I heard Rabbi Jacobson's answer, but I think that's what I'm really getting at, that in Hasidus, we're getting so high, so close to it. It's much higher than anything. Certainly an understanding of Atzmus more than a child when he says, Shal kol niyeh b'baro.
Do you think that the Jew who had mesiras nefesh in Russia asked the question you just asked? I'm doing it because I want to connect to Atzmus, or he just did it because he had mesiras nefesh?
I think he did it because he knows that inherently, or whatever his upbringing Or
No,
he
you
learns.
think he asked this question and said, how can I get to Atzmus? And the only way is through Mesiris Nefesh, or he
No.
just had the Mesiris Nefesh without thinking twice?
I think he thought more than twice about it, but I don't think he's asked the question that I'm asking. No.
Well, right, exactly, because he wasn't an American comfortable person asking questions. He just did Mesiris Nefesh. You're talking about it like almost like a prize you win. If you make the right efforts, will you win the jackpot?
Yes.
Okay, so
If
I
you
can
want to
tell
put it,
you,
if you want to
you'll
put it
never
so
win the jackpot
fastly,
with that attitude.
the
That I can tell you.
jackpot is, I mean, ultimately, we've just said that the whole jackpot is develop the most complete, deepest, intimate relationship with God that is humanly possible.
Only a
And
human being speaks
that's the
a language
jackpot.
of jackpot, not a bitteldicker person. Let me put it that way.
Well, okay, so you use the term jackpot. I'm not using jackpot. I'm saying that could we ultimately develop the most intimate, deepest
What's that?
connection
Why
with
don't you go?
God?
Why don't you just go to the pasuk? Moshe Rabbeinu, no one greater than him. He asked to see God's face, and God said, "No person can see me and live."
Yes, but there's a Hasidic understanding of that. That what is that? That lo ra'u, that you've explained before. That
I explained that. I explained.
I
But the
know.
bottom line, still, God said, "No one can see me and live." So, no, the Chassidus can't contradict that verse. The answer is that you could, that when you have the ultimate bitl and you don't look, then you'll
Yes.
find it. But as soon as
Okay.
you ask the question, you're only going to find what you're going to only find a God that fits your image. If that's what you want, that will not be Atzmus. It'll be the God on your terms. Anyway, I said what I said. What should I tell you?
Okay. I understand it now. I got it. If as long as I'm asking that question, I can't get to it. I've got to guys get there without by total bittul. Okay. I understand. That's amazing. Thank you.
That's the word. That's the word. Meaning by not looking. You cannot. You have to have a total bit. Anyway, I would suggest that we try to have a little bittul on the level of Asiya Gashmis and Chumris, of just being a little kinder to people today. Because if you're going to try to jump to Atzmus, you're never going to get there if you can't do it on a very basic level. I'm not suggesting that no one has bittul here, but I think there's many, many lower levels that we need to work on before we go to those highest levels. I understand you're asking it as a hypothetical, but the bottom line is that the goal here is that we should climb the ladder and reach higher levels of Eir until we reach as deep as we can. And everybody's going to have to do their work, what they can do. Again, it says,
I hear what you're saying, but I think that from my personal perspective, what we've been learning right now in Ayin Beis, this last part is so high and like near the top of the mountain, as well as I'm looking at that. And nobody's denying that you have to have Alice Yisrael and all of us Gashmias Avoda in this world. But I'm specifically saying when within learning Chassidus and Ayin Beis, I personally felt like we made a transformation in the last part of what we've been learning for the last month or so into to me personally, a much deeper understanding of these of Atmos and Etzema Or and Ratzon, so that of these highest levels.
and do you feel that this being reflected in our Avodah too?
Well, if you saw how I was eating my pineapple right now, I think you would say yes.
Okay.
I hope so.
Listen, you have suffered in the last few months, so
Yes.
maybe you have earned your way to places that many of us have not yet.
Would it be wrong in answer about his question? Would it be wrong to say that perhaps even the using the word relationship is not in place because as you go higher is more and more bittul hayeshus. So as we think of using the word relationship doesn't really fit with what the real bittul hayeshus is. It's like no relationship because it's bittul and more bittul and more bittul.
You're exactly right. Not only that, I'll go a step further. When you reach this level, he says there's a level of Eir, even before there's a Rotzen, even before there's a Heskim, right? A consideration that doesn't have a relationship yet. So that means if you really want to reach those levels, you have to get relationship out of your head. There's no relationship. You're just dealing with Elikus. And the bittul that you'll have is going to be your way in. So yes, what you just said is accurate, exactly the point. If you want to see me, God says, and see me, you want to see me, there's no way you can be you and you're going to be one with me. If you want to have, if you go through all the levels and you do the bittul each step of the way, then ultimately you'll reach places that through total, you'll be ready to actually have that bittul where you won't even think about yourself. What am I going to gain from this? Is it a relationship? It's going to be utter bittul. You think asks the question whether it has a relationship with God? No, it has no identity of its own in the first place. The goal here is for us to become like then you can enter. If you don't become like so as long as you're asking the questions, you're still you, which is fine. That's not a critique. That's the way God created the yesh. The goal here is that the yesh hanivra should climb the ladder of the ayin, one level after another level after another level. And yes, as you climb, you're dealing with the highest levels. And there's a point where it'll carry you into another place once you, you can tell right away, you know, like I remember a guy that was in yeshiva. So he went to, can everybody mute because it's hard to hear what I'm saying. Okay. A guy went to yeshiva, he went to study in Bryn Wa by Rab Nissen Nemenov and to learn how to daven. He wanted to be a Muslim. He wanted to be complete. So he went to this yeshiva to learn, and this yeshiva to learn Nigla, and this one Yechsidus. Then he went to Bryn Wa in Paris to learn how to daven. So I asked him, "No, what happened?" He said it was geschmack, but not as geschmack as I wanted it to be. Not as pleasurable as I wanted it to be. So I said to him, maybe that's the whole point of davening. That's not about how much pleasure you want it to be. And I reminded myself, and I told him, I once read an article. There was this guy, a big executive. He headed a big company, and he joined this Iron John movement. You know, you pay thousands of dollars, you go on a weekend with other men, and you're going to reconnect to the male, primal male beast that you are. And you do mountain climbing, and you lift weights, and you sweat, and you go through the, you know, really basically getting the man alive again, that we shouldn't be such wimps. So he comes back after the weekend, and he's telling his friends, he says, it was amazing. You know, I paid $10,000, but what I got for the return, I feel strong again. I'm able to stand up to my wife. I'm able to be more authoritative at my work, etc. Anyway, one of the guys, one of the people who worked for him, who worked in the construction department, said to him, "Listen, boss, if you want to sweat, why do you have to pay $10,000? Just come down with us, and you'll sweat all day under the sun, as when we're working hard labor, for free." So the guy says, the executive says to him, "No, I don't have time for that. I scheduled this weekend. I don't have time to come down just to sweat when." So the guy says in his simple English, he says to him, "Boss, if you sweat when you want to sweat, it ain't sweating at all." In other words, the whole yesod of Chassidus is that you should be comfortable with not being comfortable. This doesn't mean discomfort in a bad way. The idea that I need to gain something, that I need to win something, that's good for the level, it's called Shalei Lishma, where you're doing things for schar. It could be very beautiful schar ruchni, elam haba. That idea of being able to shed your identity and interests doesn't come quickly. It takes years for a person to work that hard. They say there was a chassid of the Tzemach Tzedek, and he would sleep on a bench whenever he was able to. He wanted to break his body so he should be a keli for chassidus, for elikus. Because he did this, he became sick, and he was on his deathbed, and he said these words, that if I die one day earlier, and I can't put on tefillin one more day in this lifetime, it was not worth all my sleeping on a bench. The Tzemach Tzedek, when he heard that, he said, it takes someone who slept on a bench for 25 years to make such a statement. So in other words, yes, instead of looking for glory and money and power and influence, to look for elikus is a very noble thing. no doubt about it. But as you climb, you come to levels where you come to realize that the very identity, even a spiritual identity, is still an identity. It's definitely not pure godliness. It's definitely not built in Mitzias Nimtza. That you can rest assured. And then you come to realize what Moshe Rabbeinu realized. As long as there's one tinge that I want to see your face, that I locks you out of the door. You can never see me completely because you're not ready to surrender all of you. You have to be completely ready. The only way to get ready to bittul b'mitzias, you first need bittul ayesh. You can't jump to Yechudi law without Yechudi Tata. So someone's going to say, I'm ready to go into the king without any preparation. No, it doesn't work that way. First, you have to work on yourself. You have a ish poshet. That's why I mentioned it. A little child who makes a bracha. Or a ish poshet who goes on Mesiras Nefesh. They're not even thinking about it. That's the reason they can enter, because they're not thinking about it, because it's the ish poshet. It doesn't have all the sophistication and says, oh, now I'm going to figure out a way how to get into the king. It doesn't work that way. As soon as you're figuring out, it's about you. So the ish pasha who goes into the king, like the Baal Shem Tov says, tefillah la'ani, right? And he says, tefillah la'ani ki yatif, lifnei Hashem yishbech sichi. What's the word? He says, if you go in as a sophisticated aristocrat, intellectual, even a Ovid, so then what happens is you end up having the giluyim of Hashem, because you respect the guy going to the king. He sees the literature, the art, the music, and he misses his appointment. The Ish Pasha doesn't value all that. So in his own naivete and simplicity, doesn't even realize all the giluyim. So he goes straight into the king, precisely because he doesn't appreciate it. It's like the child who wanders into the king's inner sanctum, the child who wanders into the Rebbe's room. It's because it's the opposite. There's no giluyim altogether. Chassidus wants us to have etzem and giluyim. So that's why you need to go through the whole process, because you want the etzem to come into gilui, and for that to happen, there's all these steps. Yes, in the highest levels of steps, there's the pasuk. It says, "Lo yilamdu oid isha sure'ehu." A person will not teach his friend. Ki kulam yedu esi. Everyone will know me. God, Atzmus, limiktanom vad gedelam, from young to old. So since Chafov was coming, so the Rebbe Levi Yitzchok asked the question, what's miktanom vad gedelam? If kulam yedu esi, what's then there's no kotna, no gadol. Everyone knows God. No, because everyone's going to know Atzmus. According to, there's still going to be you. There'll be the etzem, but the etzem will be according to whatever you've prepared and how you relate it. So it's etzem and giluyim, and that needs to be discussed. But the point that I'm making here is that the first thing is understanding that bittul means not just bittul on your terms, when you sweat when you want to sweat. No, you have to be sweating when you don't want to sweat. That you really do something that's completely not what is in your interest, because then you open yourself up to experiences that are beyond yourself. Okay. Let's at least finish the last few lines of this chapter. So he says like this. He means aspashtu se'er. In Ayin Beis, he clearly says aspashtu se'er, hu b'chinas hamshacha. It could be the Frierdiker Rebbe means that the main focus of is hamshacha. But so now he says, and here's the conclusion.
Usually the word oil is related to hamshacha.
Okay, it's correct. But in this context here, he did use etzem ha'er also on oil. Good. V'zehu gam ken beis b'chinas ayin. So now he's going back to the topic back on page 51. And these are also the two levels of ayin. Remember, ayin shel yesh hanivra, ayin amiti, shel yesh amiti, and ayin shel yesh hanivra. The etzem ha'er b'chinas ayin shel yesh amiti. The core energy that does not even in a state of transmission or revelation, that's the ayin of the yesh amiti of Atzmus. V'hispashtus and the extension of light energy, hu b'chinas ayin shel yesh hanivra. That's the ayin that relates to the yesh hanivra, to the created yesh. V'zeu hashita harishena. Frierdiker Rebbe adds this. This is the first opinion, the first viewpoint. Ba'ayin hamamutza ben yesh amiti v'yesh anivra. In explaining the ayin, that's the interface. The ayin of bitl of eir, that's the interface between atzmus, the creator, and the creation, between the producer and the product. And we're going to learn, from here we're going to go back to Ayin Beis, and we're going to learn a second shita. The Rebbe Rashab doesn't use the word shita. He just speaks about it in different efanim, different ways. The Frierdiker Rebbe labels it as a shita. A shita means an actual position, a viewpoint, an opinion. It doesn't mean one opinion negates, it's just different ways to explain what this ayin is, which is vital and essential, of course, to the whole theme of Ayin Beis, which is what? Interface. There you go. So we'll stop here, top of page 83, the end of chapter 18. Yes, it's very heavy stuff. I hope we made some sense of it, and I'm sure there's more to say about it all. Before we conclude here, does anybody want to ask anything now?